Not everyone's a follower of Jesus, not everyone's a Christian, but even those who are skeptical scholars, or just scholars in general, believe Jesus was a real historical person. But some people can have the suspicion of, was he actually God? Did he even claim to be God? Did he do these miracles? Did he claim to do these miracles? A very common objection people give is this analogy of the telephone game. So in the telephone game, you have people sit in a circle or sit in a line. Someone whispers a phrase in someone's ear, and they have to whisper it to the next person in line, the next person in the line. And what happens is, once you get to the end of the line, the original phrase that was whispered to the first person is completely different by the end. Sometimes it's not even anything like it. And so the question is, does that telephone game analogy discredit who Jesus is? People think Jesus was this nice guy, but as time went on and the story was being shared, that people then just began to distort who he was. And so it went from Jesus being a nice guy who helped people to Jesus was a nice guy who helped people and did miracles. Then it eventually got to Jesus was this miracle worker who claimed to be God that we have to worship and follow. And so there's a lot of suspicion towards Jesus because of this passing on of the story of who he was. I want to explain why I think this analogy fails miserably to discredit who Jesus was, whether it's the claim of his resurrection or the objection that he didn't actually claim to be God. I've heard some people say that they thought that the information we have about Jesus is hundreds of years after his time. I want to explain why I think that telephone game analogy to discredit Jesus is actually a really horrible analogy, and we should stop using it. There are so many ways where the passing on of the Christian faith and of who Jesus was is nothing like a game of telephone. So one, when it comes to the game of telephone, you can only tell the person the information one time. You can't repeat yourself. One, you usually whisper it in the person's ear, so you can't even say it with a full voice. But you can't repeat it. That person can't ask for clarifying questions. You can't have a conversation about the information. It's just a one-time transmission. The telephone game is very linear. When the Christian faith was passed on, when people were sharing it, it wasn't just one person sharing it one time to one person. They could have a conversation with each other about it. There could be much more back and forth. Here's another failure of the telephone game analogy is that it's not even just a matter of one person to one person, but when the Christian faith was being passed on, it was a communal thing. There was many people talking about it, talking with many other people, sometimes at the same time. So there's a lot of interweaving of conversation, of people sharing about their experiences of Jesus. Another reason the telephone game analogy fails to discredit Jesus' resurrection or his divinity is that the information in the telephone game is very trivial. It's a game. It's usually something silly. That's the point of it. It's not about transmitting actual important information. It's just silly information. And so just to compare the news of Jesus, the gospel, to the sharing of trivial information is just not a fair comparison, because when it comes to what was being shared about Jesus, it's something very, very important to people. This is something that people were giving up their lives for. People were changing their livelihood. Some people were getting excluded from the temple, from other Jews, from their family. And so the information being shared was not trivial. There's just a real suspicion when it comes to the transmission of who Jesus was with human memory. People can wonder, like, wow, can people really remember that and pass on the information? One thing to say is that it's important to know that when the Gospels and these other writings of the New Testament about Jesus were not written that long after the time of Jesus. The first letter of the Corinthians, early estimates would say that it was written around 5 years after the time of Jesus. A longer estimate would be 15 years after Jesus, which really isn't that bad. A lot of the Gospels, there's estimates of being written 20 to 30, maybe even 40 years after Jesus' death. The Gospel of John is believed to be written much later, maybe around in the 80 ADs. But even then, that's within 50 years of Jesus' death. And we can think, well, is someone going to remember information 15 years later, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later? Can people actually remember that? And so there's a real suspicion that there's just no way people can remember this. But the information being remembered is not trivial information. This is about people's relationships with someone, and this is about their experience of someone. Instead of comparing the transmission of the gospel to a game of telephone, we should think of it more analogously like this. Think of someone talking about when they met their spouse. Think about someone describing their wedding day. Think about people who share their testimonies of like surviving something. It could be 9/11. That is more recent. It could be like Holocaust survivors. So Holocaust survivors have shared their stories 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years after their time of surviving a concentration camp. And we believe their stories. Maybe not every tiny little minuscule detail, but when they're talking about what it was like when they arrived to the camp, who they talked to, what the guards were like, we believe all these things way after the time it happened. Think of a widow talking about what their spouse was like, what they did with their spouse, things that their spouse would say. So when it comes to experiencing other people, we have much better memory for that. If there's a Holocaust survivor talking 40, 50 years after their experience, people wouldn't say, there's no way you can remember that. That was 40, 50 years ago. This is a game of telephone. It's not a game of telephone. It's just the individual person recounting their experience. It's not just like, well, I heard someone say this, who said this, who said this. They're telling you about their experience. And we're just talking about one person sharing their experiences. We generally believe these testimonies. And here's the thing about Jesus, it's not just one eyewitness testimony, but there is a lot of eyewitness testimonies. We can think that, well, the Bible is just the Bible. We only have one source on Jesus, it's the Bible. Keep in mind, these Gospels or letters about Jesus weren't written until, or weren't assembled as one book until hundreds of years later. And so for a while, these letters were just separate letters. These Gospels were separate Gospels, all eyewitness testimonies, or getting their source directly from an eyewitness testimony, sharing about who Jesus was. So it's not just one person, but it's several different eyewitness testimonies in living memory of Jesus. And here's another reason to believe in the authenticity of the Gospels or these other New Testament letters about Jesus is that these people are making claims about things happening with individuals who are named. They're making claims about things that happened in Jerusalem. And so when they're sharing the news of the gospel, they're sharing these stories from people who were in these towns. So it could be something that happened in Jerusalem about his empty tomb. It could be about miracles that he did in Capernaum or any other town. So when people are sharing these stories about Jesus in living memory of these people, people from Nazareth and Capernaum and Jerusalem could just say, yeah, this never happened in our town, or this never happened with this person. St. Paul talks about 500 people to whom the risen Jesus appeared to. So it's not just like someone wrote down some really cool story about this Jesus guy, buried it in a chest for 600 years later, and then someone's like, hey, this is a kind of a cool story. We should all believe this. There's a continuity from the time of Jesus' death and resurrection to the writing of these Gospels or letters about him. Something worth mentioning as well is that we have other historical sources who are talking about the existence of Jesus. So we have Cornelius Tacitus, we have Flavius Josephus, and then we have a quotation from the Babylonian Talmud. And so these are different documents that are talking about Jesus, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Some talk about him being a worker of signs and wonders, but we do see that there are other references. That being said, we can trust these biblical sources, these Gospels and New Testament letters about Jesus, even though they believe in Jesus. What people want is some sort of historical resource that says Jesus Christ was sent from God the Father, he became man, he worked all these miracles, he died, he was resurrected, appeared to his disciples as risen, was ascended to heaven. Someone wants a source on that, but from someone who's not a believer. But if Jesus Christ was an actual guy who walked this earth, who actually did miracles, claimed to be God, and was risen from the dead, we can't really get a neutral source from that. I know some people just want more of a neutral source because it's like, well, if there are Christians talking about Jesus, maybe we can't really believe it because it's just affirming what they already believe. But we can't really get this kind of neutral historical information about the person of Jesus because his claims were so radical. If there was some other historical source that could confirm everything about Jesus, not just his existence and his death and crucifixion, but if there was someone who said, yes, he was all these things, he was crucified, died, and buried, he was risen from the dead, he appeared to his disciples. Well, if the person is sharing that story it's kind of easy to follow the evidence where it goes. And so I'm basically making the point that because Jesus is such a important figure, claiming to be God, doing miracles, it's hard to be neutral about him. And so, yes, we do have these resources that are from people who are believers, but that shouldn't make us discredit their testimony. I can't share everything about the proof for Jesus' resurrection and divinity. There are people that have debates on that. There are people that have written much more. This is meant to be a shorter video, mostly talking about this telephone game analogy. It doesn't work to discredit Jesus, again, because the information gets to be shared much more than one time. It gets to be spoken. There can be a back and forth conversation between two people. There are multiple people talking about similar experiences of Jesus. There is a much more of a communal dynamic. Also, the information isn't being transmitted that long before things are being written about Jesus. And so I just want to address that analogy because I think that can make people be skeptical. And so it isn't everything. There's much more to be said about why someone should believe in Jesus, but I just want to address that objection. So thanks for watching or listening. God bless.